Hello and welcome. We also, in addition to waiting for the Consul General, we have a couple of guests from Germany. So, guten Abend, willkommen. As we stated, this particular session is taking place in the English language. We have a goal of introducing Lithuania, Lithuanian history and culture to non-Lithuanians, as well as those of Lithuanian ancestry who perhaps are not as fluent in the language. I ask for your forgiveness. I'm sorry about how we're jammed in here like sardines. So some of you might know we do have a project to build another building here, an addition, a two-story addition, 6,000 square feet on the other side. Then the idea is we take this wall out, we take everything out, people have places to sit, we buy extra chairs. So it's only going to cost about $1 million. There are donation envelopes by the door. $25,000, you get your name carved into a nice stone. So we'll gladly take those. So welcome. I'm counting those posters back there. So this is our 7th DP Prisimena or DP Remembers event. And we've had self-standing lectures and presentations. We've also had groups of displaced persons who have reminisced about their experiences in Lithuania, in the DP camps in Germany, and then later on coming to America, or in one instance, initially going to Australia before coming to the United States. So without further ado, we're going to get started, and what I'd like to do is I'd like to invite the person who actually conceived this entire DP series to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the great migration of 60,000 Lithuanians out of Lithuania. So Gailė Vitas is the individual who devised this entire project and has been managing the project, every single detail from start to finish. And she's going to be moderating and introducing our speakers. So, Gailė, without further ado.
Good afternoon to all of you who have gathered here. As the Lithuanian Research Center's volunteer coordinator, I have had for a number of years the privilege of hearing little tidbits of displaced persons' histories from our Tuesday volunteers, as they have sat and worked with our archives, occasionally feeling spurred on to share certain memories of their earlier days. These lovely 4 people, as well as the delightful Liuda Česnaitė-Flores, please come up here for a second. They come here and generously volunteer their time and energies, which we are very grateful for. We're also very grateful to them for their collective experiences, as well as all their contributions to our Lithuanian diaspora history. Liuda gave us a tremendous presentation of her memories and her mother's created dolls in the DP camps a few months ago, last October. Today, I am very pleased that these 4 lovely people have agreed to share with you all some recollections of their displaced persons days and their days of settling into new lands. I appreciate all who have gathered here. I'm sorry for the squish factor. Just so that you know, each of our presenters has been asked to limit themselves to approximately 15 minutes, perhaps 20. But please be patient if we run over a little bit, because it's quite difficult to limit sharing impactful experiences in your life in such a short period of time. So we will start with our first presenter, Algis Kazlauskas. Algis Kazlauskas was born in Raseiniai at the beginning of World War II. When less than a year later, Russia occupied Lithuania, his family managed to flee to Germany in 1941. After the war, they lived in DP camps and migrated to Australia. He graduated from Melbourne University with a bachelor's in mechanical engineering, and then later earned an MBA at Northwestern University in Chicago. In 1966, Algis traveled to Chicago as a delegate from Melbourne to the first worldwide Lithuanian Youth Congress. Here, he met his wife-to-be, Teresa Prunskytė, and decided to stay in the U.S. They married and had 6 children. Algis was a scout from his youngest days, evolving into leadership positions as a cubmaster, vilkikų vadovas, and then deputy council leader, tautininkų pavaduotojas. While in Australia, he was a youth journalist for Mūsų pastogė, and then later he was on his children's Maironis Lithuanian Schools Committee. Algis has also served the Lamont chapter of the Lithuanian American community, Lietuvių Bendruomenė, as treasurer and president, and was involved in establishing a monthly Lithuanian Mass in Lamont, which eventually grew into establishing the Matulaitis mission and led to the purchase of the World Lithuanian Center in 1987.
Hi. My story is similar to that of my contemporaries who fled Russian communists. My parents acted to save theirs and our family's lives. During the first Russian occupation of Lithuania, we became repatriates in Germany, that is, having some proof of German heritage. After the war, we lived in DP camps, then emigrated to Australia, and after graduating engineering and working for 2 years, I left to work for a year in America and a year in Germany. And then I got married and stayed here. In Schlesien, my father worked as a policeman, my mother as a long-time teacher. According to my mother, when the first Russian occupation began, the house was surrounded in the middle of the night, searched, my father arrested, and my parents' pistols confiscated. They were both Cholet and entitled to carry arms. My father was taken to Kaunas prison. My mother was terrified, but she soon learned that Russians were allowing people with German relatives up to 3 generations back to repatriate to Germany. She remembered one grandmother named Zaksonaitė. After a lot of effort, frightening experiences, and the help of a priest, she obtained a document stating that her grandmother had been seen entering the village from the western German direction. My mother still had to endure grueling interrogations. On parting, the interrogator threatened, "We will find you, Petkevičiūtė, even in Germany." My mother took me and her old mother and left. We ended up in Drumburg, Pomerania, old army barracks. The Zaksonaitė document was also used for the departure of our other relatives in Lithuania. In the meantime, my father was fed only bread and water in Kaunas prison. He was interrogated, threatened for several months. One day he was taken to the German border with another prisoner and ordered to cross the bridge. His fellow prisoner was afraid that they would be shot in the back. But my father had heard while in prison that some prisoners were being released to Germany. Prisoners spread news by tapping through the walls Morse code. Both prisoners crossed to the other side safely. Father searched for us and found us in Drumburg camp. He got a job in Stettin assembling freight trains. He came home every few weeks. My twin brothers were born in the camp. I remember the birth well. You can imagine how happy I was when Mother returned from the hospital with 2 little boys. Another pleasant memory was my father taking me mushroom picking in the forest on the back of his bike. Soon we transferred to a farmer in town and played with ducks in his yard. As the front approached, we packed our belongings and took the train west to my Uncle Benedicta's family in Northam, near Hanover, where his family was renting an apartment. On the way, the train stopped several times at night, turned off its lights, and waited for the sounds of the exploding bombs to end. In Northam, when the morning sirens blared, the parents would put the twins in a stroller, and we would hurry to the nearby forest. As the bombing became more frequent, we moved to a small village that didn't get bombed. Once when my father returned to pick up things from the Northam apartment, the sirens went off. Together with the old owner, they hid in the basement. Half of our second-floor bedroom was demolished by a bomb. Father managed to dig their way out of the basement. Soon after the war ended, we watched from our second-story open-sky bedroom as American military vehicles and trucks rolled past us and down the street non-stop. A sugar factory on our street had been bombed. The Americans allowed people to take some sugar home. Uncle and Dad found a wheelbarrow and brought back a sack of brown sugar, even though it was not immediately clear how it would be used. The organizing of refugees began. We moved to a house where there were more Lithuanian families. Each family got a separate room. My mother rented a large room in town to start a Lithuanian school for the children living in our building. There were about 10 children of varying age. I and 2 others were in first grade. Father and Uncle Benedict came up with the idea of using the brown sugar to make whiskey. They rented a room in the town, built a distiller, and started distilling their brew. Suddenly, from their second-floor window, they spied a suspicious policeman. So leaving everything behind, we fled. Father also bought a cow to provide milk for us children. He kept her in a nearby stable. One night, our street flooded. There was a danger the cow would drown. In the middle of the night, my father and uncle had to slaughter the cow to save the meat. We children were never bored. The yard had a 6-foot chin-up bar. We tried to outperform each other. Nearby, on the edge of the field, were old army bunkers. Inside, we found deflated balloons that we tried to inflate in various ways. When our mothers saw this, they quickly took them away because they were condoms. A circus and a carousel also visited that field. At a nearby church, a well-known missionary, Reverend Sugintas, visited and preached a thunderous sermon of his terrifying march through a desert. After, my parents joked whether I would like to follow in his footsteps. Soon, the scattered DPs were being consolidated. Our town was assigned to the English zone. We were taken to Göttingen's former army barracks 3-story brick buildings. The camp had separate communities of Balts and other ethnicities. My parents were asked to teach school. Scouts were established, and there were basketball and football fields. In addition, the men dug and cemented a shallow pool for us children. I remember trying to swim. I got scared to death when I gulped a mouthful of water into my lungs. We had a priest in camp and a larger room for prayer. My mother enlisted me as an altar boy. During my first Mass, my older mentor, while carrying a missal from the right side to the left, tripped over a rug and fell. This scared me, but I continued to serve as an altar boy. Some of the older students in camp began attending the famous Göttingen universities. Often the camp was entertained by a basketball match between the student doctors wearing scrubs and camp boys without shirts. The fan support was raucous, but arguments between the referees were even more comical than the game. We children were well fed, but our parents had little, so they raised chickens, turkeys, and tobacco to supplement. Maybe even pigs, because I remember seeing sausages being stuffed. A popular pastime was searching for intact windows among the unused barracks. It was a great find as a target for our slingshots. Lithuanian books, old and new, were printed in the camps. The second part of the novel Algimantas was printed before the first, so that's the sequence that I read them in. We also read Dainavos senų žmonių padavimai, Daktaras Aiskauda, Skautų aidas, and many more. I remember my grandma usually sat on the edge of her bed saying her rosary or playing cards with me, and being angry with me when I won. There was a lack of jobs in Germany, so emigration began. Uncle Dominic left for Canada, forests to cut lumber. Uncle Benedict left for English mines, but without his family. He wanted first to reconnoiter. He sent me from England a big rubber ball that we then used for basketball and soccer. It was great compared to the tennis ball that we had used till then. I immediately became popular, but not for long. Someone envious cut the ball open. Uncle Benedict returned, disappointed with England, and sought to migrate elsewhere. My father contacted a friend in Argentina who had a bee farm and drew up documents for the family to emigrate. However, when Australia opened up to migrants and father learned that the Labour Party was in power, he decided that was our destination. He reasoned we would not know the local language and as laborers would be better off under a Labour government. We underwent health checks, vaccinations, DDT fumigation, and traveled through several transit camps. Fallingbostel, Zeedorf, and Fallingbostel again. There hung a fear that one of us would not pass the health check and the family would be rejected. But we all did pass. My parents had some happier moments too. I remember an evening in Fallingbostel when my mother happily set out to see a film with her favorite actress, Greta Garbo. There were also some people who got rich in the camps. The family sharing our room was preparing to migrate to Canada and was busy hiding diamonds in their luggage. I was 9-year-old when we boarded a train with all our belongings for the journey to the port of Naples, Italy. In the Naples camp, we waited for a week for the ship Amara Pura. We sailed through the Mediterranean Sea, the Suez Canal, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean, and reached the port of Fremantle in Western Australia. We were the first migrant ship to transport DP families to Australia. Before that, only single people were accepted. We sailed for 6 weeks. We stopped in Port Said, Aden, and Ceylon to load coal. On the ship, my mother organized a joint Easter celebration to include all the migrants. We also celebrated the crossing of the equator. The American officers built a pool out of tarpaulins and invited those crossing the equator for the first time to be baptized in it. The young women were their favorite target. On normal days, we played cards in the dining room. We learned wagon, pig, and liar. There were also passengers not as happy as us. Some were seasick, and we witnessed a funeral at sea of a small child. From the transition camp of Fremantle, we were transferred to another transition camp at Northam. To migrate to Australia, our parents had signed a contract to work for 2 years wherever they were needed. Father went with a team to the wheat fields to load silos. Mother found a job in the slipper factory. We moved out of the camp to rent half a house from an Australian widow. Catholic migrant children were sent to schools run by nuns and brothers, other faiths to the state school. Our neighbor with a young daughter, my brother's age, hung a rope for us to swing on and taught us to burn outdoor grass in the spring to prevent bushfires. We got used to walking barefoot through spiked grass seeds. In the city, the owner of a sewing shop was friendly with us newcomers. He told my parents he bought lottery tickets in accordance with his dream and won. He donated the prize to the monasteries, maybe not surprising since a daughter and a son were already studying in seminaries. At the end of the parents' 2-year contract, we left for Melbourne, a big city with a choice of jobs, where our mother's brother and sister and their families were already established. Nearby were 5 Lithuanian neighbors in the process of finishing building their houses that they already lived in. Their Lithuanian contractor had started construction and then went bankrupt before completing. Among the neighbors was Antanas Krausas, a former editor of the Skautų. We also learned that on the other side of the city there already functioned a Lithuanian Sunday Mass and Sunday school, basketball club, Varpas, and Scouts. Ateitininkai were later established. Annual meetings, elections, and celebrations of the Lithuanian community took place. We danced national dances, had a good choir and choir master, attended advanced Lithuanian classes and journalism courses. But our most popular events were scout camp, summer camps. The student committee organized annual balls. Sports festivals and student congresses were held between Christmas and New Year. That's the Australian summer. Newly created committees bought a Lithuanian hall and a parish house. My mother's dream of teaching again in Australian schools did not come true because of language problems. But my parents eventually bought a corner shop, somewhat similar to a 7-Eleven. When the U.S. Lithuanian community started organizing the Worldwide Lithuanian Youth Congress in 1966, the Melbourne Lithuanian community decided to participate. The Congress committee set out to send at least 6 representatives to Chicago and to pay at least half of their fares. During the year, we organized the February 16th celebration, a debate, is it worth being Lithuanian? Collected donations, and together with the student committee organized an annual ball, all to raise money for the trip. I was a delegate to that Congress, but also had a wider trip in mind. Thus, I worked in the U.S., visited Lithuania, worked in Germany, and then returned to the U.S. to marry my sweetheart. And we all joined the lives of Lithuanians in Chicago and Lamont.
Thank you, Algis. Daiva Luneckas-Bulicz was born in Freiburg in Schlesien. She attended first grade in Gronau, Switzerland. In America, she attended Maria High School, then DePaul University, earning a Bachelor's of Science in Medical Technology. Daiva worked at Children's Memorial Hospital in the oncology lab and was very involved in creating the summer one day at a time camp for the pediatric oncology patients, spending a week every year at the camp, as well as continuing their medical care. Daiva helped establish the Ronald McDonald House in Chicago, which provides family housing and resources while the sick child receives treatment in the hospital. After working for 10 years in hospital laboratories, her career switched focus to medical sales. She has been an avid Lithuanian scout all her life, passing through all the stages of Lithuanian scouting, as well as working for many years at the annual St. Casimir's Fair, designing items to sell. Daiva met the love of her life, Titus, in 1984. Where's Titus? And they have been married for 40 years. Daiva.
Daiva, do us proud. It had to be my sister. My goodness. Okay. Do this. Anyway, my name is Daiva Luneckas-Bulicz. We just introduced my husband. The very first photo I have here is of my parents, Laima Višniauskaitė, and my father, Antanas Luneckas. They left Lithuania in 1943 due to World War II, and of course, due to the impending Russian occupation. My family, in motion, as I call them, consisted of my mother, my father, and my mother's brother, Raimundas Višniauskas. Their goal, as they left Lithuania, was to head west at all cost, and by any means. They said, my parents had always told me that they traveled mostly by train, and that's how they managed to get around fast, kind of quickly. At one point, they ended up in Freiburg, Germany, and this is where I was born. That's my birth certificate and a picture of myself. Okay. One of the unluckier events while they had been in Germany and traveling was that at one point they ended up in Dresden during the very famous bombing of Dresden. The bombing included 3,000 tons of bombs being dropped on the city. 1,600 acres of the city were annihilated, and 25,000 people were killed. My parents found shelter in a tunnel, and that's where they went. As the bombing continued, the tunnel started to collapse, and a lot of danger happened. My parents had been with my godmother, who was carrying me wrapped in a pillow. And while they went into the tunnel, they were separated. So after the tunnel started to fall apart, my father and mother quickly went to find her, and they did find her, and she had passed away. But she had thrown me in a pillow further away into the rubble, so I had survived the bombing of Dresden. And the bombing was a combined effort by both the American Air Force as well as the RAF, the English Air Force. Since they were traveling by train mostly, that had been their goal, they would come into train stations to change trains or continue on the same train, etc. And my mother always told the story because she was very impressed that as they went into a train station in Germany, there was always an area in the station that was dedicated to the care of mothers and babies and children. She said they would arrive at these stations, and these areas were managed by nurses and or volunteers. But once they arrived there, the babies and children were taken. The babies' diapers were changed. They were washed. They were fed. The mothers also were given an area where they could clean up and then prepare for the rest of the journey. And my mother was always amazed that there was this sea of kindness in this horrific chaos of the war that surrounded them. It really stayed in her mind all her life. This is a map of Switzerland. By some miracle of fate, we ended up in Switzerland, and we stayed there for the entire time before we immigrated to America. We considered ourselves to be extremely fortunate and very lucky. While we lived in Switzerland, we lived in 10 different locations or cities or towns. The Swiss government would move us periodically, and it wasn't a choice of where you wanted to go, it was where they will be sending you. We lived initially in very large buildings, as I can remember, that housed many refugees or displaced persons. And then as the groups got smaller, our family was moved on our own, just our family. And we were moved into private homes. We lived with other people that had quarters for us. And then also either private homes on farms. I always enjoyed this very much because I had built-in friends. Most of these people and families had friends, children, so I was always in the company of other children, which I think also helped me learn all the different languages of the cantons that we had lived in. This is a photograph of the men being taken to work camps. My father would disappear periodically and then return. And I found out later that he was actually being pulled into work camps. And while in the work camps, they were each assigned different tasks. And my father was assigned to landscaping, which probably explains that the rest of his life we had a daržas in our backyard. And my father just loved, he loved land and the property around his house. These are some of the different locations and places that we had lived in, some of the bigger some of the bigger homes. This is one of the first places that we lived in after I was born, was a place called Yverdon, and that's my father holding me while in Yverdon. And there we also had, it was a larger building that we lived in, so there was time and area and space and people to put together a kindergarten or a preschool kindergarten. So this is a photo, and I am on that side, the little white dress, and having my head turned. Okay. We lived in many cities, as I said. We lived in Baden, we lived in Schaffhausen, we lived in Göttingen, we lived in Le Pierre, Le Mans, Baden, Le Pont. So truly, we were traveling Switzerland like a tourist, I guess, like a tourist. Displaced, the refugee groups we had, frequently if a Lithuanian family were closer together, they had an opportunity to meet and socialize. Yeah, this is Göttingen, where we had lived, the town of Göttingen. This is my father, of course, and myself, and traveling around, usually in a bike. Nobody could afford a car. And again, we are here, and at this time, we were also living with a family. I remember they had 2 daughters that were teenagers, and we lived in the upstairs apartment as they lived in the first floor apartment. And again, there's my mother and I. And again, this is in Göttingen. And this is in front of the home that we lived in. This home was on a farm, so we were in a farm situation here. Also, when we were living in the larger buildings, periodically a huge truck would come into the driveway, and the gentleman or the family leader, men usually, would go out to meet the truck and unload it. And when they unloaded it, there were huge bundles, and those bundles had contained clothing, blankets, anything that we needed that were sent to us from America by a group called Balfas, for short, and that was Bendrasis Amerikos Lietuvių Fondas, and in English it was obviously United Lithuanian Relief Fund of America. We were, needless to say, overjoyed to receive these wonderful gifts sent to us, and my mother always said that it was very kind of the American people to think of us so far away going through this war. Lithuanians, like I said, were able to get together infrequently, and not many were, because we were sort of spread out all over Switzerland. So this is a small group of people that lived in Baden and Göttingen, and we obviously had gotten together probably for Mass. And I remember the young girl to the left, her name was Grażyna. The family's last name was Vilkas, and they immigrated before us to America, and they moved to Detroit. So I do remember that. Yeah. And this is my mother holding my sister Gina, okay? At one point, we were moved to a city in Switzerland called Schaffhausen. Schaffhausen was very famous because it had wonderful waterfalls. At Schaffhausen, my sister was born, which was an incredibly joyous time for our family. However, there was also sadness then. That is when my uncle, or we called him Dede Bobas, my uncle came to announce to my parents that he decided to immigrate to Australia. So he came to say goodbye. He and several of his young friends, they were teenagers, decided that they would get to Australia quicker and make a change of their life quicker by going to Australia. He did immigrate. He ended up living in Melbourne. He raised a wonderful family, and we have obviously visited each other very often in these past years. That was a picture of my sister being baptized, Gina, and this is Gina and I in Schaffhausen in 1949. And this is the family we lived in. They had children, and that's Gina in the baby carriage, and myself in the front. But like I said, we often found families for us to live with that had children, which was, of course, for me, a very nice thing because I had built-in friends. And this is where we live in Grand Paco, and it was, again, a family, and it was more in a farm situation. We integrated very well as we moved around Switzerland. First of all, I managed to learn to speak German, French, and of course Italian before we left. My mother was very skilled in languages, so she could pick them up very easily. And so when we moved to these different locations and lived with different people, we were always accepted very warmly. We were eventually, in all of these travels of ours, moved to this town called Grono. And this was close to the Italian Alps and close to the Italian border. It was a small town, not very big at all, but it was in a beautiful valley. So growing up there, and I spent most of my conscious, younger years growing up in Grono. We had our own apartment. My father didn't work very much, as I remember, and neither did my mother. Somehow we were supported by the Swiss government. The town was not very big. There were a lot of children there. I made friends very easily, and during the days, we would just run wild and enjoy our life in this little town. We had pastures, and we had a river very close to us. We had hills and terraces of vineyards. They made wine in Grono. And so as life there, it was positively, I remember it being very, very wonderful. I also attended first grade in the grammar school there, and the school was small enough to contain all 8 grades. I attended first grade there. I learned to read and write in Italian. So when I came to America, I had a problem in spelling because I came here and there were silent T's and silent G's and whatnot. And I remember the very first spelling bee we had in a class, I was the first one to sit down because I didn't know how to spell uncle. I spelled it the way I thought it should be spelled. Anyway, in time, the Swiss government, upon entry, had given all the refugees a period of 7 years to immigrate to another country. If you did not find a place to immigrate to, you would be deported to anywhere that they decided they found space for you. During this time, I remember there was a great deal of stress between my mother and family because rumors had circulated among the refugees that trains would be coming, and the trains would be, I'm assuming Russian or something, and they would pick up refugees. Either refugees would volunteer to do this, or if not, they would actually take them off the streets and put them on the train, and then ship them back to the point of origin, which for my parents would have been Lithuania, which at this time was not a good time. So my mother and father had made arrangements with a family that lived close to them, and they had children, and they had made arrangements for the family to take me in. So if the deportation came, my parents would leave me behind with this family, and they would obey the order and board the trains and go back. Fortunately, this never happened. But now it became extremely critical to find sponsorship in America. My parents asked the Red Cross, the Swiss Red Cross, to help them, and the Swiss Red Cross connected them to my mother's distant aunt that lived in Chicago. Her name was Elżbieta in English, or Elizabeth de Gottis, and she was married to Jonas or John de Gottis. The connection was made. There were many letters sent back and forth. They sent us many gifts, etc. And finally, they had cleared the papers for us to immigrate to America. Now, their generosity and kindness to sponsor us was one thing, but they also sent us tickets to fly to America. So this was unbelievable. And you have to remember that this was before the jet age. So we flew from Zurich to America on a DC-9 4-engine prop, which needed refueling. So we went from, I remember, from Zurich to London, London to Greenland, Greenland to Canada, and Canada to New York. So it was a long trip. Once we got, and here's our greeting as we came into New York. Once we got to New York and stepped off the plane, we were met by immigration officers. They met us and told us very nicely that they would like us to visit Ellis Island for a while. We're being detained and not being allowed to move forward. So we ended up in Ellis Island for 1 week. We ended up there because my father had a history of tuberculosis when he was a young child, so he still had the scars in his lungs, and that issue had to be resolved. In Ellis Island, the women and children were separated from the men. So we had our own quarters, and Gina and I would spend our day in a kindergarten, which was not unpleasant. But we were only allowed to see my father once a day, and that was through a fence. After 1 week, my mother was told that my father was given the go-ahead to leave. And I remember she came to literally grab us from the kindergarten, and like a whirling dervish, she packed and got us all, and she got out the door as fast as she could. With that being done, we then went ahead and moved to the train station and went from New York City to Chicago by train. We arrived in Chicago, and this is my tata Elzbieta and I sitting in her front room. And then there's my mother and I and my uncle Jonas and my tata Elzbieta. They welcomed us into their home with open arms. I mean, they had literally made an apartment for us upstairs, fed us, took care of us. It was just heaven as far as I was concerned, obviously. While living with them for the short time that we did, I attended a grammar school there, and I was going to kindergarten, and I went for the all-day sessions, morning and afternoon, because I needed to learn English, which I did. However, the first word I learned was shut up. And I always thought it was one word. Then as I got older, I found out it was shut. But anyway, so that was my first word in English, to be honest with you. This is our very first Christmas in America, my sister and I. And you can see my tata with her apron on the left side there. Now, after we lived with them for the very short time that we did, this is on the north side of Chicago. We lived at that time at 4910 West Deming, which is by Cicero and Fullerton. And I still remember our phone number there, which was National 20293. So memories that stay with you, exactly. While there, I should go back a little bit. My uncle took my father out to find employment, which my father did after several days. So he had gone to work, and then my mother and I and my sister would stay with my aunt in the house during the daytime. We lived with my aunt and uncle for a while, like I said, and then my parents realized that most of the Lithuanians had settled in the south side of Chicago. So then they decided to move, and they moved to a part of Chicago called Town of Lake, which is at Ashland and 47th Street. And we lived there on the first floor, and on the second floor lived the Mickiewicz family. And Mr. Mickiewicz had been the last cabinet minister of independent Lithuania. He had 3 daughters, but 2 of his daughters were our age, Gina's and my age. So again, we found friendships immediately, and we had children to play with. I went to Holy Cross Grammar School for 1 year. After a while, yes, this is our home. After a while, the Mickiewicz and our family pooled their resources and bought a house in the further south in the Chicago area, in an area called Gresham. This was our house, and for us, 4 kids, and then we found out that our neighbors were Lithuanian, and they had 2 boys, so there were 6 of us about the same age. We found this to be heaven on earth. The house stood on one part of the lot, and the other part of the lot we had a pear tree, we had a couple of apple trees, we had peach trees, we had berry bushes, we had gardens. It was literally heaven on earth, and we were just since we were a little big group, we were allowed to roam free and run around and just have good time every single day of our lives that we lived there. We attended Gresham Public School, and Gresham made it very easy for us to be assimilated into, and we never were made fun of or mocked in any way at all. The Gresham school teachers accepted us into their classes, and they did so by saying that we were coming from far away. We wanted to live in America. We wanted to learn the culture. We wanted to be here. And that was our introduction to school. So as a result, we never had any bullying or people making fun of us, etc. And even the neighborhood we lived in, none of that occurred. It was a very comfortable and easy entrance. When we lived by the stockyards or in Town of Lake, the stockyards were still active. So during the summer, the smell was really intolerable. And that was one of the reasons my parents and Miscavige's family bought a house and moved further in the southern direction. After grammar school, I graduated Gresham Grammar School. I ended up going and following the path of many Maria girls who lived here and went to Maria High School, where I had made many, many lasting friends. And after Maria High School, I went to University of Illinois and then DePaul University, where I graduated with my BS degree. We also started, once we were more settled in, going to the Lithuanian auditorium for different events. This is my scouting time. We went to the auditorium, and it was at the auditorium that my mother re-met her very close friend from Lietuva, Mrs. Mažeikaitė, and I met Marytė. And a friend for life is right here. So our mothers they were friends, and they became best friends while living in America, as did Marytė and I. After a while, my mother and father bought their own home, so we moved to our own home in the Gresham area. And in hindsight, my Lithuanian activities were mostly focused in scouting. We were a scouting family. My mother was a scout, I was a scout, my sister was a scout, and finally, my brother was a scout. While we were living in the Gresham area in our new home, my brother Algis was born. And so Algis came home, and he was a citizen. So my mom and dad said, we need to hurry up and get our own citizenship. So we got our citizenship, and Gin and I were included in that because of our age. So also Algis became a scout. So we had a whole scouting family, and my father was frequently asked, why aren't you scouting? And his very common answer was, to be honest, I have no time. I'm driving my entire family to scout meetings, events, stovyklas, camps. He said, I'm only the chauffeur for the scouting team. I went to my first scouting camp at about 7, and from then on, almost every year until I went into college. One of the most, I think, biggest highlights of my entire life was meeting my husband, the handsome and fabulous man that I married, and we met in Beverly Shores. Yes, Mr. Lithuanian-Bulicz, and we've been married for 40 years, and now we are living the life of very happy retirees and trying to travel as much as we can. And this is one of our vacations we had gone and done during the whole 1 month in the state of Utah, and went to all the different national parks there, and this is a picture of us at one of them. Anyway, that's it. Sorry about that.
You did good.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ačiū, Daiva. Dr. Ramunė Juozevičiūtė-Račkauskienė was born in Bulicz, Germany on November 11th, 1944. She earned a bachelor's in education at DePaul University, a master's at Chicago State University, and a doctorate at Nova Southeastern University. She spent her entire career as a classroom teacher and a school counselor in Chicago and Chicago suburbs. Ramunė was president of the Youth Ateitininkų Association in 1984 and 1985 and was a Pranas Dėlininkaitis youth group guide. She worked for many years in the Lithuanian language schools and was a member of the Lithuanian Educational Council, organizing the first Lithuanian Teachers Conference, which continues to this day. She has written several booklets for young Lithuanians studying the Lithuanian language. Ramunė was the secretary of the Ateitis Relief Fund and the Giedra Women's Catholic Sorority. Currently, she serves as the president of the Draugas Foundation, which provides funds for the continuation of the Lithuanian newspaper Draugas. Ramunė raised a family with 2 children, Jonas Račkauskas and Rita Račkauskaitė-Bieliauskienė. She delights in her 2 grandchildren, Benediktas and Martynas.
My parents fled Lithuania in October 1944, before I was born. My mother's father, Aleksandras Stulginskis, was the president of Lithuania from 1920 to 1926. After 1926, my grandfather lived on his own estate near Göttingen, close to the western Lithuanian border. During his life as a private citizen, he was not involved in politics. He just wrote an article once in a while or gave a lecture. The Soviets occupied Lithuania in June of 1940 and began confiscating land and deporting people to the Siberian prison camps. Stulginskis was not concerned about himself at all, because even though the Soviets did confiscate a lot of his land, they left him with 75 acres. And he thought, well, if they left me with 75 acres, it means that they want me to still live in Lithuania. Plus, during his presidency, Lithuania and Russia had good relations. He did not expect to be woken up on the night of July 17th, 1941, and with his wife Ona, put in a cattle car and sent to Siberia. He shared this fate with 17,000 other Lithuanians who were deported that July. A total of 130,000 Lithuanians were deported in the subsequent years. They targeted members of the clergy, people in government positions, those who were educated, and those who had larger farms, which were then confiscated and turned into collective farms. Among the people who were exiled was the great-uncle of Grasilda Rainytė, Archbishop Mečislovas Rainys, who was also a close friend of my grandfather. The archbishop perished there and under the harsh conditions and was buried in a mass grave. Fortunately, both my grandparents did survive the hardships, and after 15 years of exile, the 2 fragile elderly people were allowed to come home. But they were not greeted with open arms in their own country. The citizens returning from Siberia were considered criminals by the Soviet government, and the other Lithuanians were afraid to help them. So my grandparents had no home, no job, no friends, and they lived they lived in poverty. The KGB files indicated that had not my mother, who had been living in the States at that time, sent them parcels, they both most likely would have starved. My mother was also listed for deportation that night, but she escaped because she was at the university. So she escaped their fate. My father, Jonas Juozevičiūtė-Račkauskienė, had also a black mark against him. On June 28, 1941, the Lithuanians revolted against their Soviet occupiers. And this revolt was mostly led by students. And the father of Daina Quinn, Pilypas Narutis, was the leader of one of these groups, and my father played an active part. Having expelled the Soviets, the occupation, the Lithuanians proclaimed their independence. Unfortunately, the independent government lasted for only 6 weeks when the Germans came and they occupied Lithuania. Therefore, both my parents had a good reason to leave when the Soviets came in the fall of 1944. But they were kind of reluctant because my mother was expecting a baby, me, in 1 month. But when they heard the gunfire and the bombings, they ran for their lives. At the onset, they had a wagon drawn by 2 horses that had been concealed from the German army and therefore were not confiscated. They set out towards the west, thinking that was a safe place. Along with their medical school diplomas and suitcase, they took along a pair of handcuffs. In crowded, chaotic conditions on the run, they handcuffed themselves together so they will not be pulled apart and torn apart from each other. On the way, their horse-drawn wagon was moving very slowly. There was a long line of evacuees, and walking was faster than sitting in the wagon. They left the wagon with my uncle, Father Juozevičiūtė-Račkauskienė, and I think another friend, Jonas-Getchys, whose daughter is here today, and they set out on foot. Among the gunfire and the bombings, my mother became very tired. A German convoy was passing by, and my father asked if my mother could sit on the back of the truck for a while. The driver said yes, but his truck was carrying dead soldiers. My mother was afraid to get on that truck. I listened with sympathy to the accounts of my slightly older colleagues who, with their parents, they fled Lithuania and endured the bombings and the terrors. I was much luckier. I was born towards the end of the war in a town called Bulicz, Germany. The town is now called Bobolis, which is now part of Poland because of the land partitions that happened after World War II. Because the war was still going on, my birth certificate has a German swastika on it. There it is, and so as well as Daiva's. Yes, right. My parents fled with very little, so when I was born, my mother had absolutely nothing as far as baby things. The Germans' Women's Club donated baby supplies, even a baby carriage. My mother was completely overwhelmed by this generosity. This was one of the several indications of the German people's sympathy and generosity shown towards the war refugees, as Daiva mentioned, the sea of kindness. On the whole, my parents did not talk about any anger or hostility shown toward them, only an occasional grumble of, "There's too many Ausländers here," when they were on a crowded bus. Later, my family settled in a small village in Bavaria near Regensburg. My father was employed as a doctor in a nearby town, and my mother and I stayed with a German farm family. The German family was very hospitable and provided my parents with the only room in the house that had a heating stove, and I got fresh milk every day. Years later, my parents still talked about the generosity of this wonderful German family. My father bought a baby book for me, and though it was filled with mostly domestic things, I was able to glean a few things that happened at that time. For example, my mother's fear and dread that the Bolsheviks would come to their little German village and capture them. Her terror when the house shook from the Allied bombings the American and British were bombing nearby. Both parents had such an intense longing to return to their homeland. Living with a friendly Bavarian family, my first words were not Lithuanian, but German. At about a year old, I toddled into the kitchen and saw a pot of hot potatoes cooling on the floor. Thinking the pot was for me, I sat down on it, and the German family got up and shouted, "Nein, nein, heiß," and my first word was heiß. Okay. On May 8th, the war was over, and the American soldiers came into that small village. The German villagers were hung white sheets from their windows to indicate their peaceful surrender. They struggled to find their whitest sheets. The Soviet army also crossed the border and were already in the country. The American soldiers were eager to befriend the Russian soldiers. They instructed the housewife at the farm, Frau Klaukenmeier, to sit down at her sewing machine and to sew red ties for them, which they wore to show their friendship to the Soviets. Later, my parents were celebrating their birthday with a cake which was on the table in their room. A young American soldier barged into their room, took one look at the cake, and grabbed it and ate the whole thing with his bare hands. And my father wrote that they were totally appalled by this behavior. And he observed that, well, German soldiers never acted this way. On the whole, my parents were very disturbed by the eager camaraderie shown by the American soldiers towards the Soviets. About 1946, we moved to Augsburg, where my sister Jūratė was born. Luckily, we were in the American zone, and as far as I remember, we children had a very easy life. The American administration forced the German families out of their apartments, out of their homes, to accommodate the war refugees. We had 2 large rooms on the first floor of an apartment building, which housed other Lithuanian families, among them Vida Maleškienės family, Juozevičiūtė-Račkauskienė, and Stasys Baras. And I had the freedom to run outside, but I definitely could have used a lot more adult supervision from the things that I did. Augsburg had a Lithuanian school, and there I am, standing on this chair, and I had no idea why I was standing on that chair with that horn. I didn't quite understand that this was a Christmas play, but that's me there. And the school I went up to 6th grade, and then the older children went to a high school in a nearby town. There were about 300 Lithuanians living in Augsburg, and they also, besides the school, they had the cultural groups, the scouts, and so on. Okay. Our home was very close to a wooded area, and I remember my family making frequent excursions into the forest. I remember that I amused the adults. There we are, my sister, me, and my parents in the forest. We're all eating an apple, it looks like. I remember I amused the adults by talking to the squirrels in Lithuanian, and surprised they didn't understand Lithuanian, so I was, why don't they understand me? But we children were never hungry, but the food was probably not the best. Our parents struggled to provide enough. I remember my mother grating carrots to make juice for us, carrot juice, so we'd get some vitamins. She later told me that these were the carrots they gave to horses. They were not really supposed to be used for human consumption, but you had to have something. My parents kept a goose in the basement, which was fed and fattened and then cooked for our nourishment. But I refused to eat it because I had made friends with that goose. So I remember. My sister was a little bit underweight, so she was given kogel mogul, a concoction made from egg yolks. You remember kogel mogul? From egg yolks and sugar. To me, this looked like the most delicious thing in the world, but I was not given a bite because I didn't need it. It wasn't for me. And eggs were so precious. But I was once given a rare treat. I had come down with pneumonia and was very sick for a while, and there was no medicine. And people around me thought that I might not make it. Father Juozevičiūtė served as a chaplain for the Augsburg Catholics and was able to visit the U.S. soldiers at their barracks and to ask for help. The soldiers gave him a big bag of oranges, which he took back, and the vitamin C did help me get better. An occasional package came from our uncle living in the United States or from UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Association, in a supplement our food supply, and gave us toys, candy, and which otherwise we never saw. In 1949, when I was about 4 years old, my mother's uncle, Kazimieras Stulginskis, living in the U.S., had made arrangements for our family to emigrate. European refugees required a sponsor to ensure they would have housing and food and quick self-sufficiency. And there we are leaving for the United States, and this is the front of our house in Germany, the apartment house. The Army ship General Taylor took us across the Atlantic and were placed in segregated areas, the men in one area, and then the women with small children in another area. But I never saw my father the whole trip because he was seasick the entire time. And there we are standing with the Yugoslavian friend of the family on the boat, my sister and I. Okay. Our ship sailed to New Orleans, and I remember how delighted we were to see the dolphins jumping in the water. Our train took us north to my mother's uncle's farm in Danville, Illinois, where we spent the first summer. As a child coming from the city, I was astounded by what I saw on the farm. There was no plumbing or electricity in the house. We used outhouses and kerosene lamps for light. The kitchen, the kitchen had running water that needed to be pumped by hand and heated on the stove. Lest you think my uncle was just backward in his home remodeling, remember this was 1949, and many farm homes were in this condition. In 1936, the Roosevelt administration had passed the Rural Electrification Act, but my great-uncle's farm was only electrified in 1949. Even in 1950, 20% of the U.S. farms were not electrified. And this is me in the barnyard. I was very proud of myself having fed the geese. And see how rural the farm does look. Again. My father did not stay with us, but he went to St. Anthony's Hospital in Chicago to do his medical internship. There was a cohort of young Lithuanian doctors who had just come into the country and did not have a state license, who participated in this program. To this day, I'm astounded how my father, 1 week off the boat, not knowing one word of English, not knowing anything about the American medical programs, was able to pass this internship. In the fall of 1949, my family moved to the Brighton Park area in Chicago, and I attended the Immaculate Conception Kindergarten. I did not know a word of English, but that was perfectly okay because the room was full of other Lithuanian children who also were in the same boat. It was wonderful. My mother, a medical school graduate, took a job in a factory as a janitor, and she was grateful for that job. Once she overheard her coworkers talking, "Listen, we've got to get the kid a gift for Christmas." And the kid was my mother, who was only 27 or 28 at the time. But someone else said, "Oh no, the kid doesn't need any presents. She comes to work in a fur coat." Actually, my mother came to work in the only coat she had, an old Persian lamb from Lithuania. That's all she had to wear. But this conversation among the factory workers about the gift reflected the warm reception our family experienced during the first years in the United States. And this is Easter, my first Easter with my sister and I in the United States. My father, having completed his internship, was able to be employed in the state hospital in Jamestown, North Dakota. In the 1950s, there was a state hospital system which housed the mentally ill. As you know now, the state hospital system is not as prevalent, and the mentally ill are treated in different ways. In all, about 300 Lithuanian physicians came to the U.S. after World War II, and all of them had to pass the state licensing exams in order to practice. Until they passed the exam, they were able to work in state hospitals or in laboratories. The Lithuanian doctor had a close-knit community. There was ALDD, the American Lithuanian Doctors Association, and Gaia, the Catholic Doctors Association. These organizations had meetings, conferences, and published their own materials and had a very close communication. The state licensing exams were very difficult and required a great deal of preparation. In Jamestown, my father was always walking around with a book. He was always reading, studying. When a doctor did pass the boards, the medical community rejoiced. I remember a colleague of my father, Dr. Sabataitis, was at our house once, and he casually mentioned, "Oh yeah, I just passed my boards." And my father said, "What?" He jumped from his chair, ran across the room, and kissed him. And to this day, I remember this outburst of affection and joy. My brother Jonas was born in 1955, and I like to think his birth brought luck to our family, as my father passed his state boards a few years later, and he was able to get a staff position at Holy Cross Hospital, open up his own office, and for many years he was the medical director of the Chicago Alcoholic Treatment Center. And there maybe somebody knows that nurse. I don't know who she is, but she was a Lithuanian nurse with my father. While living in Jamestown, we were distant from a Lithuanian community, including Saturday schools and cultural groups. Despite this, we maintain a strong Lithuanian identity. At home, we only spoke Lithuanian. My parents read to us in the Lithuanian language, and my father created stories for us, which was probably the most wonderful thing in Lithuanian. And we kept the customs, the kūčios, margučiai. My mother gave us Lithuanian grammar lessons, which we really enjoyed. So we came to Chicago in 1954 when I was 8 years old, and were able to join the vast Lithuanian community. Lithuanian Saturday School, drama groups, and cultural organizations. The most enriching of all of them was Camp Dainava. And here I am in the middle, sitting there with my hand on the bridge with a whole bunch of other counselors at Camp Dainava in about 1960. Yeah, 1960. You might notice some people there. I spent my entire career teaching in the public schools as well as a school counselor. And here I am on a field trip with some of my third grade students way back when. And they're, yeah. The Museum of Science and Industry, yeah. When my children joined Lithuanian activities, I also participated and became involved with the Ateitininkai. And here I am judging an Easter rolling contest after Easter. Yeah. I very much enjoyed teaching in the Lithuanian Saturday schools and served in the Lithuanian Educational Council. And there we are. I'm at the left there with all these people there at the council. Even as a grown-up, I attended events at Camp Dainava, especially the Labor Day studies weekends. Robertas Vitas had given a presentation, I think, on the Lithuanian Constitution at that weekend, and here I am congratulating him. The American teachers had developed a program called APPLE, the American Professional Partnership for Lithuanian Education, which presented educational innovations and methods to teachers in Lithuania. And here I am on stage at the end of the program. We had a program at the end of the teaching situation. I also belong to American Catholic Women's Group Society called Giedra, and among our regular meetings and activities, we arrange cultural events for the Lithuanian community. And this was a musical event arranged for us quite a few years ago, and there we are standing with the presenters. My mother is still with us at almost 104 years of age, and we are fortunate to be able to visit her and spend holidays with her. And that's my family at the Easter time, okay? And as I prepared this presentation, I reflected on the events that led to my being here in the United States. World War II and the Soviet occupation was brutal and robbed us of our homeland, and most importantly, it robbed us of our people. But that we had to leave behind. But the events also revealed glimmers of humanity and the kindness and generosity of many people that helped us on my journey. Thank you very much.
Ačiū, Ramunė. Marytė Mažeikaitė-Utz was born in Kukerneze, Kaliningrad region, East Prussia, as her parents fled Lithuania during World War II. After living in Scheinfeld, Germany's displaced persons camp, her family relocated to the United States. Marytė earned a Bachelor's of Science in Speech Correction in 1970 and worked as a speech pathologist in Illinois and Maryland. She received credentials from the American Montessori Society in 1990 and worked for 5 years as director and teacher at the Lithuanian Montessori Children's Center in Chicago. Marytė has served in various Lithuanian organizations throughout the years, including Lithuanian Mercy Lift on the board of directors, the Lithuanian Center, Jaunimo Centras in Chicago, as a board member and chairman of the board, Lithuanian Folk Dance Festival as chairman of the board, and currently she is a board member of the Draugas Foundation. Since 1954, she's been an active member of the Lithuanian Scouts and currently runs the Displaced Circle. Marytė has 3 children, Andrius Utz, with wife Lisa and their children Andrius and Anastasia, Onutė Getsevits with husband Rimas and their children Veronica and Evelina, and Stafutė De Agostino with husband Matthew and their children Greta, Eleonora, and Pauliukas.
It's been a long sit. We can shake those butts a little bit. Move it, move it, move it. Get a little exercise in. Okay, I'll get serious. Over the years, my parents shared memories of growing up in Lithuania, of their parents, siblings, and relatives, as well as friends and classmates. They spoke of how they met and their flight from Lithuania during World War II, and of my birth. In 1995, they agreed to share their memories on camera, so I'm very lucky to have that. I had an opportunity the last couple of months of watching it over and over again to refresh my memory. My presentation today is a condensed version of their much more detailed oral history. I'm going to start with their meeting in Kaunas in 1943. Cupid had scabies. My parents, Pranas Mažeika, a fourth-year medical student, and Aldona Irena Petkevičiūtė, a student in the nursing and midwife program, were brought together by scabies, niežai, at the Kaunas Clinic Hospital, where Aldona, doing her practice, contracted the highly contagious parasitic scabies and was hospitalized. She became the focus during a clinical round of doctors. Pranas recalls taking immediate notice of her blonde hair and beautiful brown eyes. Aldona only remembers shutting her eyes tightly in great embarrassment. After Mother recovered from scabies, they met at a dance and had a very short courtship, actually. Love bloomed especially during the war. Pranas and Aldona married in the spring of 1944. After graduating from medical school, the Department of Health in Lithuania assigned Pranas to start work in Birštonas at one of their sanatoriums. At the end of July and beginning of August, a second Russian occupation became a reality. As the Red Army neared the town of Alytus, my parents began to withdraw westward, stopping to rest with family members in various locations and to gather news of the Russian advance and the withdrawal of the German army. A horse and wagon were obtained from my father's uncle, Tomas Mažeika. He gave it grudgingly. He wanted it back before they hit the border. Later, my mother's family, her parents, her youngest brother, Romas, and two aunts with their husbands joined them. They traveled in two wagons into an unknown future and a quickly approaching winter. In the beginning of October, my family, together with large numbers of refugees and the withdrawing German soldiers, crossed the Lithuanian border into East Prussia. My mother was in her last month of pregnancy, her 9th month, and I was preparing to meet this chaotic world. On October 11th, I was born in a house located in the small town of Kaukamen, and the Germans had renamed it Kukenese. Now it is part of the Kaliningrad region that the Russians occupy. The next morning after giving birth, my mother, father, and my family and I had to leave again. We had to flee once more. Days later, in Derschau, a town on the Vistula River, a poor woman with children opened up her heart and her small home, providing us with a respite for 2 weeks. My birth was officially registered there, and I was baptized on October 27th. Yes. I think that's the baptismal certificate, yeah. Oppression continued into 1945. We kept moving forward into Bavaria in the hope of being in a right location for when the war ended, meaning hoping we'd be either in the American or English zone. Survival in Germany meant working to get a food ration card. The available jobs needed skills most refugees didn't have. My grandfather, Vladas Petkevičius, learned to repair shoes, resulting in bruised and bloody fingers and hands. Fortunately for my dad, doctors were in great demand. The adults constantly suffered hunger, cold, and cramped living conditions. My mother said that it was the coldest winter in memory. The letter. In 1945, we were living in a hunting lodge near a small Bavarian village north of Regensburg. In May, 2 Black U.S. soldiers entered our lives and helped us make contact with my father's oldest brother, Antanas Mažeika, an American citizen living in Pennsylvania. I'm going to read a very short excerpt of the letter. 650th Quartermaster Truck Company, APO 403 at Postmaster, New York, New York, the 27th May, 1945. Dear Mr. Mažeika, it gives me great pleasure to write these few lines to you, and it was even a greater pleasure to come in contact with your sister during my travels in Germany. I was taking a truck on a trip from Nuremberg to another point. I was with another friend, and we decided to do a little investigation on a secondary road. We came upon 2 middle-aged women who were enjoying their afternoon lunch. The women offered us some of their food. Knowing that food was scarce in Germany, I offered them rations that I had. They showed us to their house, which was still deeper in the woods. The house was beautiful. It was a 2-story, well-furnished house. I and my friend were introduced to your sister and 2 more women and a man. They asked us to supper with them, and they were very hospitable. When I told her I was living in New York, she mentioned her great desire to live in the States. She also mentioned that she had a brother living in Philadelphia. She then produced a letter and asked if I would mail it. I agreed to do my best. If the Army did not drop the censorship, it would be difficult for me to send the letter. The censorship had been dropped on the 25th, and I met your sister on the 14th. Before we left, we gave them rations enough to last for 3 weeks. I am assigned to a colored outfit which do a lot of driving for different purposes. The queens, or women here, are the best I've laid eyes on yet. From a GI in Germany, your pal. The letter was sent, the letter was received, contact was made. DP camp. At the end of the summer, all foreigners and DPs were instructed to travel to Regensburg, where a large camp was open to house and disperse refugees to other camp locations. In April 1946, we were relocated to an all-Lithuanian camp in Scheinfeld, Bavaria. My parents had a small room in the barracks built to house workers during the war. I lived with my grandparents, Uncle Romas, 2 married great-aunts in a large classroom divided with blankets in place of walls. Our space had a window into the courtyard. My days were spent exploring, which resulted in a few misadventures. I remember climbing the sides of the camp's deep garbage pit. I don't know how deep it was, but it looked pretty deep to me. After getting to the top, I managed to fall in. Luckily, somebody was watching and saw my big bow disappear. Rescue came, and I don't remember being scolded. We were blessed to have close relatives in America sending us care packages, which were often used for barter. On to freedom. At the end of November 1948, my parents and I received notice that we could enter the U.S. We were transferred to a transitory camp in Bremen. There we shared a room with other families. Then it was on to Hamburg to board the SS Marine Flasher. Mom and I shared a four-bunk cabin with two other women. My father was quartered with other men below decks sleeping in hammocks. On the first night before departure, everyone was served a wonderful meal, the best they had ever seen in the last number of years. Sailing out of the harbor after dinner, the waters became rough, and many became very seasick. My mother had a stomach of steel. She ate the whole trip to the United States, and she was proud of it. Welcome to America. Debarking on December 21st, we were welcomed by my Uncle Anthony and his family. That's my Uncle Anthony with my mother, yes. Aunt Susan's parents living in New York City took us in. After the New Year, we left for Pittsburgh to a rented house not far from my uncle's family. We lived in a Lithuanian neighborhood next to St. Vincent de Paul Parish, where Lithuanian Franciscan nuns taught school. My mother worked as an unregistered nurse in a local hospital, but my father did only odd jobs because the state of Pennsylvania did not allow foreign-trained doctors to practice there. During the week, Pastor Luneckas' housekeeper, Sophie, cared for me at the rectory. I often provided them with entertaining insights into my parents' adjustment to the land of opportunity. I don't have time to go into the details, unfortunately. By the end of summer, my mother's widowed aunt, Natalia, joined us and became my caregiver. My life was an adventure. Learning English from my cousins, Tata Natalia asks, "Kas yra kaubojus?" What's a cowboy? My cousin Antanukas answered, "Karvės vaikas," a cow's child. I celebrated cow's child. Makes sense. I celebrated my 5th birthday American style and my first Halloween with lots of treats and a bit of a scary situation. A decision was made to move to Chicago, Illinois, so my father could study and take the medical licensing exam in English. My grandfather, Petkevičius's 3 older brothers, all lived in the Midwest. They left Tsarist Lithuania as young men for a better life. Uncle Barney, Bronislavas, owned a bank and lived in Chicago's Brighton Park. He got us a 2nd-floor cold water flat with no hot water in the neighborhood. Our apartment had no central heat. The landlady who lived below had heat, and she would turn on the hot water on Friday so we could take a bath. I didn't mind. I don't remember being cold, but I do remember the hot Chicago summers when we slept with all windows open to catch a breeze. There were no air conditioning in the home. In the 1950s, many first-generation Lithuanians had summer homes in Beverly Shores, Indiana. It soon became the Lithuanian Riviera. And I have to tell you who these people are. My father is on the left. My aunt, Vanda, is pregnant and is standing next to her. Ponas Balčiūnas is in the pajamas, height of fashion. My mother is next to him. I'm kneeling on the sand, and the couple next to her are good friends, Petras and Kazytė Skėrys. I attended Immaculate Conception grade school from kindergarten through 3rd grade. Most students were of Lithuanian heritage. The Sisters of St. Casimir taught a daily language class. There are some people here who are in that photo, besides me. That's our first Holy Communion photo. Soon my extended family joined us in Chicago, the center of Lithuanian life in the U.S. Family gatherings and celebrations were frequent. The struggle for Lithuania's independence was a constant topic of concern, as well as a need to keep the Lithuanian language and culture alive. For my friends and I, the Lithuanian language was our secret form of communication in public places. Once in a while, we'd get caught by some Lithuanian that we didn't recognize. Yeah. The American Dream. In 1954, my parents began living the American dream. My dad opened his medical practice, and our first house was bought in a new development near Midway Airport. My brother Jonas, John, was born, the first native son. I attended St. Mary's Star of the Sea Catholic School with students of various ethnic backgrounds, Italian, German, Polish, Irish, and mixes of. On June 26, 1956, I became a naturalized American citizen. My Lithuanian life expanded when I joined Lithuanian Scouts and began attending Lithuanian Saturday School at St. George's Parish in Bridgeport. I lived in 2 culture worlds without conflict. In 1956, my father was drafted into the U.S. Air Force. That summer, my mother, brother Jonas, Uncle Romas, and I drove cross-country to Fairchild Sac Air Force Base outside of Spokane, Washington. The diverse vistas of America opened up before us. I attended Our Lady of Lourdes School in Spokane. A school bus drove us Catholics into the city every day. My scouting continued on base as an American Girl Scout. Our troop leader was a French war bride who provided opportunities for me to share my Lithuanian heritage. The Air Force families were very welcoming to us. We enjoyed a new social environment. I learned to snow ski, horseback ride, and to handle a canoe on a river trip. May 1958, my father was discharged, and we headed back to Chicago and our extended family. A new chapter of my life began. Membership in Lithuanian Sea Scouts, participation in the 4th Lithuanian Scout Jubilee Camp in Highland Park, Michigan. During my freshman year at Maria High School, new friendships bloomed, and life was again an overlapping of 2 worlds. I felt safe in both. In 1960, we moved to the Beverly neighborhood in Chicago, and my youngest brother, Patras, Peter, was born. My parents had adapted to life in America. In 1968, my mother and I flew to Lithuania to visit my paternal grandmother, Veronika Mažeikaitė, and other relatives. I was the only grandchild to meet her. It was a very emotional 5 days. Like waking up in a dream, I felt a very strong connection of coming home. And that's another trip we took, but this was in 2000 after doing a cruise on the Baltic. I'm on the left, my nephew Stephen, my daughter Stephanie. The other side of the monument, my brother John and his daughter Katie. On April 4th, 1970, I married John Utz. We have 3 children, Andrius, Onutė, and Stefutė, as well as 7 grandchildren. John was always very supportive of all my Lithuanian volunteer work. He even put up with my speaking only Lithuanian with the kids at home. They were told it was their job to translate for Dad. I love America for giving me a home and freedom to pursue my life. I love Lithuania for her culture and language, which has not only enriched my life, but also given me a strong system of values. Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much to all four of you. I can't even imagine living through what you lived through, flying on a DC-9. No thanks, a 737's bad enough. All four of the presentations had tremendous nuggets of information, but I was struck by the letter that Marytė read from that quartermaster unit. So where your family touched a little bit of greatness, that transportation, so he refers to a colored unit. Most of you probably know that the armed forces were segregated until President Truman desegregated them. So you had white units, black units, you had Japanese American units fighting in Europe, for instance. So that transportation unit actually became very famous. It was known as the Red Ball Express. And they're the ones who were able, as the front was moving, they're the ones who were able to get the munitions and the supplies to the soldiers. And they truly distinguished themselves. And indeed, in the 1970s, there was a television show on CBS called Rollout, which was based on that. So there's history all over the place. Kristina's going to close us out by talking about upcoming events. Kristina, our president.
I just want to announce a couple of more events that we have. 3 more events planned until until May. So next Sunday is going to be Žydronė professor from Vytauto Didžiojo University. She's going to talk about the publications in DP and what Lithuania had done about about that information. Also, the very next Sunday, April 6th, we're going to have another event that would present kind of bridge between the first immigration, first wave, the second wave, and the third wave, Regina Butkus and Jonas Platakis, and then May 18th in Lithuanian Center in Chicago, Jaunimo Centre, we're going to have kind of closing event, and we're going to have the exhibition from Draugas, how they were involved in DP and in DP life. So thank you for coming this time, and invite you to come to our rest of the events.